Welcome back to the channel. We had a huge update that changed several barrels when it comes to rifles and LMGs, and that's what we're going to focus on today, what slips into the meta. Obviously, if you watched my first video kind of talking about the brand new weapons, you know the MG is definitely tier 1, 100% within the meta. If you saw any tournaments or gameplay today from people, that is a meta gun. Now let's talk about some of the other ones that might have slipped in and if AMAX is still viable after all these changes. If you enjoy the video, learn something new, please do me a favor, hit the like button. If you're brand new, want to find your way back, double check, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. And we're going to be looking at a few different factors. Most importantly, we have recoil, because that's really what this change comes down to. How much is it actually helping recoil? On top of that, are there going to be scenarios where this is going to make you too slow? Because at range, you typically want an aim down sight between around 400 up to 500. 500 being on the slow end for ranged weapon, because AMAX is kind of setting the bar at around 407. And then we're also looking at DPS, or damage per second, at long ranges, because this is theoretically how consistent you're going to be downing people. And then that correlates generally to a consistent TTK. Not always perfectly 1-to-1, but it is a very good estimate of where those TTKs will land. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about which weapons we'll be looking at. So there's a viability now with a lot of these weapons that didn't exist before, just because they had too much recoil and they weren't allowed to compete with the AMAX. So what I wanted to do is kind of get a little bit of a comparison. So that's what we're going to take a look at first. We're going to look at recoil with the fully decked out builds, reducing recoil as much as possible. So using the heaviest barrel, which is this bottom barrel right here, that's going to also give you vertical and horizontal recoil control. On top of that, we got the agency or GRU, which is going to help with a vertical recoil, and then we're also going to use the field agent grip or equivalent that gives you horizontal and vertical. So we're getting the maximum recoil reduction possible. If you can't control the recoil with all those attachments, then that makes it not as viable at range, regardless of how much DPS it's putting out. So that's why you got to combine those two factors. And then on top of that, you're going to have varying skill levels, where this one might be difficult for one person, a little bit less difficult for others. And if you're really a top tier player, you could probably do most of these, but not all of these are going to be great options, even if they have the best TTK possible or the best DPS possible. So now let's go ahead and look at the recoil head to head. So I've actually done something a little bit different here. We focus on a few key weapons here. We have the lines here for the Stoner, the Cold War AK-47, AMAX, FARA, QBZ, Krig, Groza, FFAR, as well as the XM4 and the RPD. What I do have here on this screen is one bar that goes all the way across the screen, and this is more of where the AMAX is, because if it's around the AMAX or less, then it becomes very viable in terms of recoil and handling, and then that's when we're going to go to the next number, which comes down to that DPS. When you combine those two, they happen to be better in DPS or about the same as the AMAX but with less recoil. That 100% makes it a viable long-range option. Obviously, there's going to be certain scenarios where you kind of got to look at the actual recoil pattern and decide for yourself. On the bottom, I kind of have a negative of it, just because that allows you to essentially see the recoil pattern for the most part a little bit easier, with the exception of some of these shadows messing that part up. But we'll go ahead and get into that. So you can see that this blue line right here, it's a little bit harder to see, but that's where the Stoner recoil comes up. And these were all fired with a 45 round mag, or I made it so that there was 45 bullets before I started shooting. I started at the bottom of this door, same distance, shot up and saw where it went. The AK-47, the Cold War version, actually still has a decent amount of recoil. Can people pull it off in moderation? You can see it kind of has a little bit of a jumpiness in the beginning and then kind of tightens out towards the end. Cool if you're waiting that long to get control of the weapon, but this one still has more recoil, so that one's going to be a high skill weapon. Vast majority probably not using that at range, because I think most people struggle with the AMAX, especially if they're on console. They'll use the FOV as an excuse to say that it's impossible to control, even though I know plenty of console players that control it, but obviously they're a little bit higher skilled, so that's kind of how it goes. We have the Stoner, comes in at a little bit less, but it's straight vertical, so it's the easiest kind of recoil. You pull straight down. You don't have to worry about adjusting for wobbling. You don't have to change your direction at any point through it. Stoner is definitely going to be tier 1 again. Obviously, you got to factor in that it's going to be slow, which we'll get to, but it is going to be tier 1 in terms of being able to control the recoil, and as we'll see with the DPS. AMAX kind of goes up, a little bit of wobble, but nothing crazy. Farah, I was incredibly impressed by. You can see it kind of goes up and to the right really quickly within those first 10 shots, and then it goes up and to the left, slight diagonal, but there's not any spaces, like large spaces between these, which means it's very manageable at range. Once you get past this first 6-7 bullets where you get this little bit of a kink in it. And then we also have the QBZ, which you can see the QBZ looks like it has a relatively straightforward recoil pattern, goes up, and then kind of the bullets kind of stop. They just continue to hit the same spot. And we're going to see some of these instances, and I've kind of highlighted some of these as we go to the next one. So we got the Krig, which you can see the Krig right here has a huge kink in it, and then it cuts right and then curves around. There's two different things you can do it. You either get used to it, which is a little bit hard, or you fire about 15 bullets, you release the trigger and pull the trigger again, and then it resets it. So you just get this vertical component, which the shots are relatively tight. We also have the Groza, which I think is going to be a no-no at range, even though it got buffed in a couple different ways. It's going to be a little bit more flexible as an SMG because it has good aim down sight. But this little kink here and here are going to cause a little bit of issues where it kind of goes up and then bends to the right and then goes and then bends to the left. And you can see the spacing. There's a little bit of spacing as compared to some of these, which any little bit makes it a little bit harder to control. Even though the actual vertical component isn't even that strong, it has a little bit too much wobble, I think, for majority of people to use at range. Then you can see the FFAR. Kind of shoots up, almost has a very similar recoil pattern to the AMAX, but it's as if it got stretched out, which vertical, not a huge difference. This one might be more of a keyboard and mouse gun where they can just adjust it and adjust to that and still be strong. Still requires a lot of skill, but I don't see a lot of controller players using the FFAR as their primary ranged option. Then you have the XM4, which could theoretically be good if you do the same thing that we're talking about with the Krig. You get one good jump in the first, between the second and third shot, goes pretty straight, and then it hooks right and then go diagonal up and to the right, which this little hook right here makes it much harder to use and leads to less consistency at range. So that's something you'd have to be aware of. Then the RPD, we're getting something similar to the Stoner, but you can see it's a little bit less. And the thing is after this one gets to about 20-ish shots, you could just hold the trigger, not move, and this thing just keeps going straight in the same spot. Maybe a little bit of bounce side to side, but it's just pretty much in the exact same spot, which is kind of what we're seeing there. So in reality, if I did like a 10 recoil pattern, this thing would have stopped a lot lower. Or maybe a 60, it would still be in the same spot versus some of these, they would be much higher. So you can kind of see how these reflective here. Not perfect, but you can kind of see the AK comes up here and it actually goes a little bit higher than this one shows just because of the shadow. You can see the AMAX where it ends. The Farah comes down incredibly low. QBZ, super easy to control. Krig, you can see the kink there. Groza, we got the double kinks there, and then the Farah a little bit, but then it goes all the way up to the top, pretty much over here right below the text. XM4, pretty solid, and then RPD, you can see it stops right there. So pretty straightforward. Now let's talk about DPS and time to kill. So we're primarily focusing on the weapons that were impacted by these changes. The MG, I still have to level it up to get consistent comparison, but it's probably going to fall in line in between the RPD and the Stoner. We'll have to find out once I get that fully leveled up, and then I can give you a more accurate comparison. But right now, that one's 100% meta, so we're not really worried about that one. People are using that perfectly fine with the builds, and we know that it's good, and you're not being penalized hard. So I wouldn't worry too much about that one. And the same thing with the C58. I got to get more data on it, but we do have the DPS values to compare, and we'll go ahead and look at these here. So if we do this by the long range DPS, and this is what you're looking at for the upper chest at far distances after its furthest damage drop off. So for some of these weapons, it could be 40 meters, 30 meters, 60 meters, whatever that last damage drop off is. We're talking about everyone as far as you can be, and you're hitting with 100% accuracy. What is the damage per second? The MG82 comes in at 458. The AK-47, the Cold War version, comes in at 380, but as we saw, a little bit harder to control. AMAX still up here on the list with the recoil kind of where we've seen it for quite a while. The FFAR up there in terms of DPS because its fast fire rate and its damage stays consistent at 25 damage per bullet, even at the furthest distances, which makes it 10 shots to kill. The Stoner comes in very aggressive. Then the Farah, this is probably going to be the sleeper for some. They're going to get their hands on it. They're going to get way more comfortable. This probably benefited the most out of kind of comparing some of how the guns feel. I think the Pharah benefited the most because it was just a hair too hard to use, I think, before. At range, reliably, you could get some consistent kills out of it, maybe with the Susat when that was the thing. But beyond that, it kind of was still a little bit inconsistent. I think this one kind of bridges that gap and helps out a bit. Groza, we saw the problems with that one. XM4, still reliable, but I think this one's still going to be more kind of on the back burner because its DPS and its recoil aren't particularly special at range, so that kind of drops it off. RPD, its TTK is not great because of this lower DPS, lower rate of fire. It's kind of like a slower firing stoner, which is still relatively close, 40 DPS there, but the thing with this one is it has almost no recoil, so it might be more practical for more players just because it's easier to use. So you're more likely to get close to this theoretical damage or this theoretical time to kill. So because you're hitting more shots, technically the RPD could be better for some individuals because of how they've modified these things. It just depends. And you can see the Krig, not special in terms of DPS. As long as you get some headshots in the mix, you can get this TTK a little bit more consistent, but the Krig is probably not going to be it. I think some people will like it, maybe on Rebirth, or maybe on closer ranges, but if you're actually trying to down multiple players, it's just not as effective. If we're looking this compared to like the AMEC, there's like a 20% difference in terms of damage, which is huge. The Pharah, we're getting about 12% more damage output out of it. And if you're going to get comparable recoil, you might as well go with something that's going to put out more damage and you don't have to worry about that random kink in there, or at least as big of a kink in that recoil pattern. So it kind of gives you that. And then these ones are just kind of like hand testing numbers before I actually looked at those recoil patterns. I went, put on those attachments, fired the weapon, and decided, all right, how hard is this to control? And then these kind of the numbers I kind of came up with out of a 10 per se. They could be a lot worse. No attachment, AK-47, you got way more recoil. That's going to be closer to that. And there's a few weapons in those categories, but these are kind of how those work out. One of the biggest downsides about the AK-47 is its fire rate. So we'll see that on a larger comparison. But here's the part that I wanted to talk about. We did fully built weapons, and the only thing I changed was the barrel. So this is the main one that used to only be bullet velocity. Now it helps with vertical recoil. That's the Liberator, the Groot Composite, and the Ranger. So this is the one we're talking about depending on the weapon. So we have a 400 ADS, which is pretty good, and it's going to help out with that. And the recoil didn't seem to change when I swapped to the one that had maximum vertical recoil and horizontal recoil, which this recoil 2 and the ADS 2 is built for the one all the way at the bottom, the slowest. And then the ADS speed 3rd is the one in between them, which for this one, it's primarily that reinforced heavy. This is the match grade for the LMGs for the recoil 1. So we'll go ahead and kind of look at that. So overall, the ADS speed on the AK-47 is still pretty solid at 400. If we go ahead and go a little bit lower, you can see the FFAR got penalized really hard. That is a slow aim down sight considering the AMAX is 407. Stoner, you expect it to be slow. It's right around 500. And then we have the Pharah at 450. Groza at 384. It actually maintains its ADS speed across all the different barrels. For whatever reason, it doesn't look like it's impacting it the same way. We had similar issues when it first got added, so maybe it's just a smaller percentage because the ADS speed's already faster, and since it's based off that it'll scale a little bit. And then we have the RPD, the Krig, and the QBZ, which you can see the QBZ and the XM4 come out faster. And that's generally why the XM4 performs so well up close, because without all these slowing down attachments, you actually get a good mobility, good ADS speed rifle that could be used as an SMG. So you got that there. And then the slower it goes, obviously you end up with some issues. So there's going to be really comes down to preference. You're using this at long range, so the ADS speed isn't as important. 500 is pretty slow. Stoner 534 is going to feel really slow. So you might want to stick with the match grade over the Task Force because of that extra 2 frames at 60 FPS difference in terms of your ADS speed. Then when we go to the spreadsheet that's linked down in the description, you can go ahead and click on this and see the different TTKs, how many headshots you need, all that type of stuff, along with a bunch of loadouts that I still need to update. But they basically just changed all the barrels. So we got to kind of rework some of these things for the rifles, LMGs, and even tactical rifles. I've gone and included all the weapons we're talking about today. They've been added to this particular list. And what we can see here is all these weapons compared head to head based off long range DPS. They are sorted by long range DPS. And what we can see right here is the MG82 comes out far ahead, way far ahead on terms of TTK. These are the TTK that your opponent feels, but the difference between you pulling the trigger, you get an open bolt delay that adds on a little bit of time, but your opponent doesn't know that. When you pull the trigger, the first bullet that hits them, and by the time they've died in 9 shots, they feel 524 millisecond TTK at range if that is 100% accurate. It also has an incredibly fast fire rate, which makes it very forgiving. So if we look at these DPS, we got Cold War AK, which we saw the recoil is not for everyone. AMAX, pretty solid choice. PKM, still very good option. Might be a good option if you don't want to use the MG82, but it is what it is. FFAR, as we saw, not really as viable because of that recoil, even though its TTK and DPS are pretty solid. We have a Stoner, very, very good option after this update, but it's going to be a little slow on the aim down sight. Bruin's still in the mix. Pharah, this comes out probably ahead, in my opinion, out of all the Cold War rifles, I think in terms of the best chance to kind of get close to that AMAX, because you can see this one is 340 versus 380. You know, that's about a 10% difference in damage. In terms of TTK, we're talking about having a 667 versus 684. That is a lot closer. That's like a few percentage difference. So the Pharah is probably going to be the best option in terms of getting close to what you felt like before the AMAX got nerfed, and still being easy to use and reliable. It's going to be in there. For some people that's a little bit of a challenge for, they might decide to go with the Krig, which kind of falls down a little bit low on here and actually does less damage per second, but also has a relatively close TTK to the SA87, which isn't particularly amazing, but it does do a pretty good job if you manage to land the right shot. So that's kind of how it works out. RPD's in the mix. XM4 probably wouldn't recommend. Now let's talk a little bit about loadouts and how you're going to stack these weapons. So we'll focus on the Pharah, even though pretty much all the weapons are going to pretty much mimic it, and then we'll give if this or that, depending on preference, because a lot will change depending on what you prefer in the game. I think when it comes to the muzzle, you're probably going to go with the GRU suppressor. You can still get pretty good bullet velocity with the suppressor. And there's instances that maybe if you wanted to go to the Spetsnaz, RPK, Task Force, whatever the bottom one is, that's going to slow you down the most, but it's going to help with vertical and horizontal recoil the most. You might want to go with that one so you get range, bullet velocity. The range is going to offset the suppressor, so you end up aiming down sight a little bit faster. If you don't care about how slow it is, then you go with the GRU suppressor. So this is where you got to kind of make a judgment call. You're going to get into a match and say, this feels too slow, then put on the suppressor. Well, it doesn't feel like it's hitting hard enough, then maybe you got to go with the GRU suppressor and then swap over to the Liberator, and then that'll give you max bullet velocity. Or that it's not going to be quite as slow as the bottom barrel, and it's not quite as fast as the middle one, but still provides a good benefit to both vertical and horizontal recoil. So you kind of got a trade-off. Personally, I would probably still go with the suppressor. I'd go with this bottom one here. I would either go with the Spetsnaz grip, which in some cases is what it is, but we're talking about getting horizontal and vertical since we're focusing primarily on range. I'd still go with the 60 round mag, and then I'd go with the 3X optic. That is how you're going to build most of the Cold War rifles. Like I said, you can make the judgment call. If you want a little bit better bullet velocity, a little bit more range, go with that route, and then maybe swap to the Liberator, which is going to give you the benefits without all the cons of this one. So you're still going to have decent aim down sight with the Liberator, which is going to be the fastest of the 3 barrels that now help your vertical recoil. So that's kind of how you build that out. Then the other one is going to be the LMG category. And when we go to the LMGs, we're pretty much going to build these a majority of the same way. We're going to go with the agency suppressor. We're probably going to go with the match grade so we don't get quite as slow, because this one's still going to help you out with bullet velocity. It's a great option, especially if you remember what we've had before with LMGs. This is a very good option, whereas before it wasn't all that great. You can go with the field agent grip. Some people are going to say that maybe you don't need that. That's really going to depend on your skill level. You're going to go with the 3X for the optic. And then what you do is you get a free attachment. If you want a little bit faster aim down sight, you can go with the airborne elastic. That's going to help out tremendously. You can go with the fast mags if you feel like you want the extra ammo reload speed. If you want a little bit more mobility, you can go with the Tiger Team Spotlight. Or you can go with the Raider pad, and then you're going to get that extra mobility since you don't really care about hip fire. And then this weapon should perform very solid for you. Obviously, a little bit more aggro. You probably want fast mags or a bigger mag. Keeping in mind, that's going to slow you down even more. And copy, paste those particular loadouts to the weapons that make the most sense. Obviously, kind of narrowed it down. You have all the information you need to make the class setup that's going to work best for you. Hopefully, you guys did enjoy the video, learned something new. If you did, please do me a favor, hit the like button. If you're brand new, want to find your way back, double check. Make sure you subscribe with notifications on. Thank you for watching. As always, have a great day.